Harrison Birtwistle's Mask of Orpheus is a work of great depth and complexity. This will come as no surprise to those familiar with Birtwistle's music more broadly, given his meticulous attention to detail, but in the case of the Mask, we find this complexity compounded by a deeply esoteric and multifaceted libretto from Peter Zinovieff. While Birtwistle's other major operas have, on the whole, plots which are much more direct and even simple, acting as a counterbalance to the always detailed and volatile soundscapes, the Mask makes no such compromise. It is perhaps as challenging as the music itself, although for different reasons. In this video, I want to make the case that the Mask of Orpheus is in fact a Gnostic and even Luciferian opera, aware that these two qualities could rub up against each other when joined in a single interpretation. Nevertheless, I think it is possible to draw out both elements in an attempt to decode the themes of this work. I hope that even if you disagree with this interpretation, you find it at least intriguing to some degree. I believe that the last thing this opera is incoherent, in spite of its surreal and apparently absurd elements. It has at least as much logic and coherence as a dream, and a great deal more than that, I would argue, since while the second act, which I am analysing now, presents us with a dream scenario, it is obviously carefully constructed by Zinovieff, and not left to chance. This dream setting is an important entry point for our interpretation, because I think among the various influences at work, a prominent one is Carl Jung's depth psychology. The first thing to stress is that this second act is not only a dream, but a journey into the depths of the psyche. We begin in this production with the character Orpheus, among the standing audience in the Royal Albert Hall. I take this to signify the fact that the character Orpheus is us, the audience, in terms of being an individual who emerges from the collective consciousness of humanity. Thus his journey in the course of this story is one in which we are all participating, and he represents just one facet of humanity, perhaps the ego, whatever we understand that to be.
I remember the arches. I can see a deep valley. 17 arches cross it from one mountainside to the other. The side to the east is dead and dry, cold, quiet, and almost still. But on the other side are people, and it is living. There is movement and laughter, warmth.
I emphasise the fact that this is a facet of humanity, because I think we are dealing with a dialectical approach to human nature, which polarises the notion of the individual and the collective in terms of fragmentation and fragmented identity. This is exemplified in the use of mirrors, both in the staging and in the libretto. The mirrors, of course, are a typical symbol of a fractured psyche or a split psyche, such as we find in cases of DID, dissociative identity disorder. Thus we have to get away from the idea that these characters on stage represent complete human beings. We're being presented rather with something like the ancient Greek idea of persons as personae. This is based on the myth of Orpheus, after all, and the persona is precisely a mask which is used to draw out or isolate one slice or aspect of humanity. In this opera, the ancient Greek theatre melds together with Jungian depth psychology, as well as other more occult themes, as I suspect. The fragmentation or DID theme is heavily emphasized by the literal splitting of Orpheus and Eurydice within the opera. That is to say, we have multiple singers playing Orpheus and multiple Eurydices. As one commentator says, it's a piece of doubles, we might say doppelgangers, and the fragmentation is compounded by the displacement of time and chronology within this act of the opera, such that we have Orpheus questioning Eurydice at one time during the act, and hear her disconnected answer at a completely different time, as if they are separated by some abyss or rift which even affects time itself. We know the story of Orpheus and Eurydice is one of recovery, or failed recovery more accurately, and so already we see on this level of interpretation the recovery in question is precisely an attempt to restore and heal a fractured psyche. I do not think this quite covers the deeper significance of this act, however. And this is where things begin to get stranger and stranger. There is, alongside the psychological dimension, alchemical and occult symbolism. This is perhaps to be expected when dealing with Jungian themes, because Jung devoted a great deal of effort towards decoding alchemy in terms of psychological processes. It may be that Zinovieff is using the psychologist as a kind of launching pad to explore these concepts. We can interpret the whole descent of Orpheus into hell and his return to the world as an alchemical and ritual process taking place in this second act. There is reference made to a black sun and a half sun, which symbolize stages in the transmutation of metals.
The spaces shrinks, the noise becomes fainter. I can hardly see the arch as the sun shines black against the new bricks.
I also think this alchemical aspect plays into the wider theme of separation and conjunction. In the staging for this act, there are 4 main characters on stage who appear to represent Orpheus, Eurydice and their doubles. And by the end of the act, after various configurations, they are standing in a square formation, which I take to represent the separation of the 4 elements as the culmination of the alchemical process. Yet there is also a spiritual aspect, which I would call Gnostic, in the idea of the conjunction of opposites, the reunion of Orpheus and Eurydice. This plays into the notion of the union of the self with one's Sophia principle, a Gnostic idea. This also has links to the Kabbalah, which clearly informed early Gnosticism. In particular, we can think of the tree of the Sephiroth, which in the broadest terms may be understood in terms of a process, be it temporal or metaphysical, of separation and reunion between masculine and feminine principles. The feminine principle par excellence is the Shekinah, which in Kabbalah is derived from references in the Hebrew Bible to God's direct manifestations of his glory, or his presence on earth, in contradistinction to his absolute transcendence, placelessness and dislocation, so to speak. Now bear in mind that this is symbolized on the Sephirotic tree, a visualization of this process, in terms of a masculine principle at the top of the tree, and a feminine bride, the Shekinah, at the base of the tree. At the moment of climax in the second act of the Mask of Orpheus, the Orpheus narrator character cries out, "The king stands highest," which could be a reference to Kether, or the crown, the highest principle on the tree, which symbolizes the union of God and his Shekinah. This vision immediately crumbles, however, in just the same way that Orpheus looks back and loses Eurydice for a second time, irretrievably. Following this loss, the orchestra and performers in the production hold up mirrors, once again stressing the fragmentation which I believe we can directly associate with the loss of Eurydice, as well as the separation of God from the Shekinah, and her return to the base of the tree of the Sephiroth. The cyclical form of this process is vitally important to grasp, because it plays a wide role in the imagery and symbolism of the opera. Indeed, by the end of the act, Orpheus ends up repeating lines which had been sung by Eurydice at the beginning, obviously stressing their duality and complementarity. The idea of countryside and landscape also has a prominent role in the second act of the Mask of Orpheus, and it occupies a place in very close proximity, literally speaking, to a portal opening up to a wasteland, to death and destruction. This proximity of nature, life and innocence to death is significant of more than mere morbidity, but feeds into the Gnosticism of this opera, in which life and death are just 2 points in a cycle of destruction and regeneration. We've interpreted this already in terms of psychology and of spirituality, and now we are tracing it at the macrocosmic level, in terms of the very environment represented in the opera. It is an abstract and symbolic environment, it is true, but that only concentrates this impression of the cyclical process. Birtwistle himself was attracted for a long time by the idea of ritual in music, and he was clearly infatuated with Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. Thus it's not surprising to find in this Orpheus myth the idea of rites of cyclical regeneration, which were a focus of the likes of J.G. Fraser in his famous study of myth, The Golden Bough. However, even beyond this, I think this work has subtle undertones of something darker, even of a Crowleyan, Luciferian New Age or Aeon, which would tie in with the themes of Gnosticism. The Gnostics believed in an evil creator or demiurge who had imprisoned humanity in the material world, and I think we find this demiurgic figure symbolized by Apollo in this opera. Paradoxically, however, the representation of Apollo with a fully synthesized robotic voice and a made-up language suggests the notion of a deus ex machina, an emergent deity in the transhumanist sense.
Of wings, it smoulders.
If anything, this notion strengthens the Gnosticism of the opera, because man ends up constructing his own demiurge and forging his own chains, in a Rousseauvian sense. It was Rousseau, after all, who said that man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains, a mantra which inspired other Gnostics of the likes of William Blake, for instance. The technological aspect is significant for its ties to the idea of the matrix, of a synthetic reality which imprisons us, and from which we seek to be liberated. Zinovieff, the librettist of the Mask of Orpheus, after all made his career in developing computers, and can have been no stranger to these concepts. In any case, we have reference to the clanging and tinkling of brazen bells, and I think this can be related to the idea of the brazen head, which was a mythical alchemical head made of brass, which was said to speak of its own accord. In effect, it was a kind of foreshadowing of modern pipe dreams about artificial intelligence. This brazen head idea also suggested the possibility of possession of a machine by a demonic entity, and I think that there is something to this notion. Certainly the voice of Apollo in this opera sounds very sinister and demonic, and he seems to rule over the fate of Orpheus. Finally, the idea of escape from matter or the false reality of a created world also ties in with Gnostic attitudes towards Lucifer as the light bringer and rebellious liberator of mankind from all laws and strictures. This liberation is intertwined with the reunion with the Sophia principle, and I think this is perhaps the key to understanding the references to jewels lying in the water, that is, lying within or just beyond the abyss. I think there are some subtle references to the biblical book of Ezekiel, which is particularly revelatory in the account given of the fall of Satan. In chapter 28, verses 11 to 19, it reads, "Moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation for the king of Tyre, and say to him, Thus says the Lord God, You are the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You are in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering, the sardius, topaz, and diamond, beryl, onyx, and jasper, sapphire, turquoise, and emerald with gold. the workmanship of your timbrels and pipes, was prepared for you on the day you were created. You were the anointed cherub who covers. I established you. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked back and forth in the midst of fiery stones. You were perfect in your ways from the day you were created, till iniquity was found in you. By the abundance of your trading you became filled with violence within, and you sinned. Therefore I cast you as a profane thing out of the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the fiery stones. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. I laid you before kings, that they might gaze at you. You defiled your sanctuaries by the multitude of your iniquities, by the iniquity of your trading. Therefore I brought fire from your midst. It devoured you, and I turned you to ashes upon the earth, in the sight of all who saw you. All who knew you among the peoples are astonished at you. You have become a horror and shall be no more forever. In the biblical cosmology presented in the book of Ezekiel, as in the book of Revelation, God is seated on a golden throne, atop the mountain of paradise, from which flow the 4 rivers of the world.
Contrast, meaning to hope.
In the Gnostic subversion of this cosmology, however, it is the evil demiurge named Yaldabaoth who reigns over the created order. These rivers in their overflow symbolizing the emanation of matter and the material order from a higher spiritual realm. Therefore, in being cast down, as in this passage from Ezekiel, it is Satan who is regarded by the Gnostics as being in solidarity with mankind, and as the true liberator and light-bringer who shows us how to rebel against the evil Yaldabaoth. These are all common tropes in Gnostic and Luciferian worldviews, and I do not think it is too great a stretch to analyse this opera in terms of these tropes. Whether or not he was conscious of the fact, I think even Birtwistle himself had a kind of Gnostic attitude towards the world, in terms of his feelings about pain and suffering in this life. Thus we come back to the recurrent images in this act of the opera of the waters of the abyss, which seem to hem in Orpheus on all sides, like the Gnostic cosmology of the Ouroboros, the encircling serpent. Indeed, on emerging from the underworld, he speaks of coming from a cave into a stone house, with stones above him and rocks below.
Did I build this stone shelter over the dark cave? Above my head is stone, under my feet is rock.
This is not only an echo of the Hermetic idea of as above, so below, but another metaphor of his imprisonment in the very world itself. I think that these metaphysical ideas are really packaged in a Jungian way. As a psychological quest, as I began this video by suggesting, and hence we see at the end of this production of Act 2, Orpheus, the narrator, or the ego if you will, returns to his place in the audience from which he emerged at the beginning. If this reading of the opera has any merits, I think it would place the Mask of Orpheus alongside Karlheinz Stockhausen's epic operatic cycle Licht as another Gnostic-themed operatic work of the 20th century. Both of these works are deeply mythic and ritualistic in character, and as I suspect involve some syncretism of various traditions combined with technological innovations. I hope you enjoyed this video about Peter Zinovieff and Harrison Birtwistle's opera The Mask of Orpheus. Do please comment if you'd like to see similar content to this in the future, and be sure to subscribe to the channel.